Steve, then Matt, then Austin.
Just before I come to my questions, just to clarify what the Chair just asked, you said around 50 million has been sold this year?
In this year, yes.
Okay. Last year, I think from memory in your annual accounts, you booked about 44 million, if I'm correct. So that would suggest that actually you need to increase your disposal by 4 times for each of the remaining years in order to hit your target. Yeah, if I'm correct. Is there any contingency set aside for missing that target, or will that have to come from elsewhere in the MOD budget?
That's the subject of a piece of work we're doing at the moment, because since on the 18th of July, the rebasing of the Army from Germany into the United Kingdom was announced, and as the Permanent Under-Secretary mentioned, that actually removes 20% of the Army in total. But what we've been holding is a slowdown in the disposals programme, because we have to actually look at the asset base that we hold in this country, because effectively the estate we're disposing of, first and foremost, is a state that's rented from the German government.
Sure. I get the point that if you're slimming the Army, the amount of people you have in Germany, if you're holding a state for those coming back from Germany, that's one size. If you've got less troops because you're reducing it, the amount you need is going to be less. So there's something in there. But I take it was a yes, that you're going to have to increase the rate of savings by 4 times.
Well, you didn't let me finish my answer, and I would have gone on to say that actually we are doing a piece of work at the moment to actually establish what is the laydown of the Army in the United Kingdom over the rest of this decade. As a result of that, we are expecting to then identify a secondary wave of disposals that we will be able to make starting from the middle of next year onwards, when we will complete the rebasing study. We've already published this year on the 5th of October the interim disposal strategy for the Ministry of Defence, which has identified a core group of assets that we will dispose of during the rest of this CSR period, and then there is a secondary list that should emerge as a result of the rebasing exercise.
I'm just conscious of time. What I was driving at is if 50 million this year, 44 million last year, 1.5 billion target over 8 years, that just struck me on the maths as being around increasing the savings around 200 million a year.
Yeah, and indeed we are planning to achieve that.
So we need and there doesn't seem to be any contingency there. Could I ask about a governance point? If you sell land, it's often common practice that there's an uplift value if you sell land that doesn't have planning permission attached, and then planning permission is granted. The value of that land obviously increases exponentially. Are there any circumstances, and who would be the accountable person if that uplift value was waived?
I'm not sure I understand the last part of your question.
In other words, is there any circumstance in the last couple of years where the MOD has waived the option of uplift value on land it's disposed of, and who would be the accountable officer for such a decision?
Well, the SRO for the sale of land is myself.
Yep.
Historically, the MOD has sought planning permission for land that is selling for disposal as a pre-step to them making those disposals. I'm not aware of, and I can't answer the latter part of your question, but obviously I'll make sure you have an answer.
Could you have a note? But if the uplift value had been in the terms which were discussed with initial bidders, and that was then varied, that would require your sign-off?
To my knowledge, yes.
Okay.
Steve.
3 quick things from me. Just some reassurance. If Scottish independence were to go ahead, if Scottish independence were to go ahead, can you just reassure us that any disposals will be looked at in terms of anticipating that? And particularly driving at naval assets or disposals that happen, which in a number of years' time we then find actually we either should have retained or would have been useful. I mean, it may seem an unusual idea to talk of Scottish independence, but we do have a majority government in Scotland.
And defence is not a devolved matter. So
at the moment?
At the moment.
Yeah. So is it part of your contingency planning or not, I guess?
Okay, quick, next one.
Second was with the Red Arrows. If you decide you don't actually need the base from a Red Arrows point of view, but the FCO do need the base, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office usage, is that, would you still be able to push it across to them, or would you have to retain it because of usage from another department?
We don't have to retain things because other people want them. We would take a value for money judgment, and if it was a value for money judgment that we had booked a receipt, say, in our accounts, and it was actually better value for money for the government as a whole, not to do that, well, then we'd have a discussion with the other government department about ensuring appropriate
But you're
asset
picking up the
transfer.
full cost.
Sorry?
You're picking up the full cost.
Well, we're picking up cost for bases that we are predominantly using, yes.
Right, okay. And the final one was just, if we're going to reduce the number of tanks we've got, what sort of cost savings are you expecting to get in terms of operations in Canada?
We have a study being undertaken by the Army at the moment about the implications of the change in the return from Germany and the size of the regular and reserve army, and that's exactly the space that they'll be getting into.
So there's no actual target figure in terms of... Because what's unclear to me is how many estates in the UK we're retaining provisionally for what's coming back from Germany, and whether we've got oversupply there and we're retaining more than we need. And obviously there's the estate in Canada, which is used for live firing.
Training estate,
Which is
yes.
a training estate where, again, if there's going to be significant reductions, the usage would, I assume, fall. And again, if you've got this target of £1.5 billion, to what extent are you expecting to pick that up from less requirements in the UK for the troops coming back from Germany, balancing that against any subsidy the German government gives for troops that are located in Germany, and also making savings in Canada? And I just don't get a sense as to how that cost benefit is fitting together.
No, I was going to say, I mean, Canada would be an operational saving. It won't actually represent a disposal for us because we don't own the estate in Canada.
No. But you're
But-
paying a
but-
fee each year, sure.
Indeed.
So I said it's an operational saving.
Because it's a very, very complicated plot, the thing we published in July, which was the first go at basing, is being refined through the work that the Army are doing about the implications of the change in the regular reserve balance and about the coming back from Germany. And clearly that will feed into use of training estate. But it applies to a lot of our estate. We'll have to have a think about, do we want to not use estate in Canada, but if we had to re-provide some of it here, that might give a cost. We are just working our way through that.
Okay.
And the size of the Army is the...
Thanks very much. Steve.
And just puzzled by your comment about sort of revising the guidance for accounting officers. I mean, firstly, on Richard's point of accountability, if you look at a programme like the Fire Control, Regional Fire Control, the accounting officer for 5 years, 2005 to 10, was Sir Peter Housden. It was a disastrous programme. He was also the worst performing department for the CSR 07-11, less than 5% of his efficiency targets at the interim stage, but he's been promoted to be the top official in Scotland, so there hasn't been accountability there. We had a hearing last week where there's 54 programmes that HMRC, 54 change programmes, they couldn't even tell us how many of those 54 programmes have started or how many of those need to go wrong for someone to be actually accountable. So that it isn't clear who's accountable. And we actually had an exchange back in January where I raised the issue of accountability for foundation hospitals, which are outliers. And you promised to write to me, and you did. You wrote to the committee in April, you then wrote again in June, you then wrote again on the 18th of October, describing it as a thorny subject, but it's still not been resolved. Where you have significant outliers, whether the accounting officer who is giving the money out is going to be fully accountable for that, or whether it's local boards. And so we just get the same issues time and time again on these committees, where whether it's fire control, whether it's the new HMRC change programmes, where the accounting officer's on long-term sick, but at some point presumably will be coming back and be held accountable for some of those. And yet, even though since January we've had this issue on the table with you, we still haven't had a clear answer. So why is it that the revised guidelines provide us with adequate comfort on this?
Well, to be fair on the issue of foundation trusts, my understanding is that you are having a session with the accounting officers for health and education in the reasonably near future, and I think
The health haven't yet to
Well-
produce their accountability statement.
I do think this idea of producing an accountability statement is, in principle, a positive one, but you will have to satisfy yourself with it,
But
and
it's
the Treasury
okay.
will be doing its best, and Paula, I know, is involved in these statements in trying to produce ones which resolve this interesting tension between centralisation, devolution, being able to really Parliament be able to satisfy itself that money is being well spent. But your wider point, I think, is a good one about, and it's one which comes up over and over again around length of tenure. This is kind of, as I enter my 7th year in my current post, this is concentrating my mind, since actually I think it's fair to say that if anything happens in the Treasury, I should be accountable for it. I think again, I'm biased because I've been in the Treasury a long time. I do think there is a benefit in permanent officials doing their job for a reasonable length of time, especially if there's very rapid turnover of ministers. I'm glad actually under this government that the ministerial turnover seems to have declined considerably, because I do think these issues of accountability are important. In terms of the wider, your point about consequences, I think this is something we've got to continue to work on. You know, we did introduce a system of performance-related pay where actually weaker performers were identified. I don't want to get into individuals, but you'll be pleased to know that there will soon be a new head of the civil service and a new cabinet secretary, and I'm far more junior than these people, but I will seek to use my influence from the Treasury to ensure there is stronger accountability.
But perhaps just to bring it to life, I mean, there's one, the individual accountability, and as Richard alludes to, I don't see that changing. But to give an example, again, you were saying, well, Treasury is following up on the recommendations of these this committee and driving a culture change. If we take the example which I flagged in advance of Ofcom, where the NAO found that Ofcom, in their view, were double counting. We as a committee made a recommendation saying Ofcom are double counting their savings. This, I'm sure, is not particular to one arm's length body, and the cumulative spend of arm's length bodies is significant. And yet in the report, in the Treasury minutes, you say, well, their existing methodology is compliant with Treasury principles. So on the one hand, you accept the recommendation saying they're double counting, but on the other hand, you say, but their approach is compliant and they will continue to do it in the same way.
I think the two issues here. One is pure double counting is clearly silly and wrong, and I wouldn't want to see in any aggregation of efficiency savings double counting. The second issue, I think that one of the techniques they used for deriving savings was to discount future savings and produce a net present value. That is a perfectly respectable technique for identifying savings, and it's something the Treasury would do the whole time in investment appraisals and so on. But double counting is wrong. The Treasury doesn't support it. Actually, we don't any longer produce long aggregated lists of efficiency savings. The Cabinet Office does, but only on the Efficiency and Reform Group programme. But my understanding is that they got quite a good clean bill of health from the NAO in their latest assessment of savings. So
no, the question I'm asking, Sir Nicholas, is they filed their accounts in a particular way. We made a recommendation saying we didn't approve of that. Their accounts this year are still filed in the same way, as I understand it. They still are exaggerating their savings. Well, is that not the case?
If I'm happy to go away and explore that and get the Treasury to explore that, and if they're doing it wrong, we...
But you're saying this is compliant with the Treasury, so there's enough room in the Treasury guidelines. So what I'm saying is you've got a contradiction here, which is on the one hand saying we accept a recommendation, and on the other hand saying but the way they do it currently is perfectly fine.
I think probably to take this forward, because Steve won't give up on it. Yep. To take it forward, I think the most sensible thing is if you do go away and just write us a note within a week as to is there a conflict?
My point is less about Ofcom. My point is in microcosm, the spend. It comes back to this accountability issue. The spend of arm's length bodies is huge. When an issue arises, quite often the people they contact are the members of Parliament, and yet we have very little grip on those savings. There's no common definitions in the way their accounts are being filed, which is a major issue. So it's very hard to compare between arm's-length bodies, and there isn't really much drive from the centre to standardise data in a form that allows us to identify outliers. So it's less about Ofcom specifically, but it's the fact that you've got spending by arm's-length bodies that is deliberately misleading, and even when it's pointed out, very little seems to be done about it.
Well, it goes back to the earlier point. I mean, maybe our response to in the Treasury Minute needs to just be a bit sharper, and I will take this one away.